Welcome back to the farmstead. Today we are making some easy refrigerator dill pickles. And to start with, we're going to make the brine. We're going to start with 4 cups of water, 2 cups of white vinegar, 2 tablespoons of kosher salt, 1, 2, and 1 teaspoon of plain white granulated sugar. We stir it well so that everything's blended. We're going to heat it until all of the sugar and the salt are well dissolved. And we'll stop by and stir it occasionally as we're doing other things. And this will take a few minutes. Now once it's all dissolved, we'll take it off the heat and we'll let it cool completely before we pour it over our cucumbers. Now in our little hydroponic garden here, we've been growing some dill. And it's gotten kind of wild and wieldy and bushy. So we're going to trim it off. We're going to trim it back pretty good. And we're going to use this to make our pickles. It was a pretty good handful of it. I'm still not sure about this little hydroponic thing, but we're giving it a go. The cilantro and the dill are doing good, but not much anything else. But we'll keep it going for a little while. Now the cucumbers we're going to use are ones that we actually had left over from my cousin's wedding. And they are just regular store-bought cucumbers. I also had some jalapeños here at the house, so we're going to make half of the pickles hot and half not. So I'm just going to slice up the jalapeños into rings. And we'll put these in the bottom of the jars that we want to be hot. Now they ended up being warm, not particularly hot, but we used up what we had, and they sure were pretty. I'm going to use wide mouth pint jars for this, just because it'll be easier to load them in there. And into each of the jars, I'm doing 4 jars here to start with, I'm putting a teaspoon of garlic powder. And then I'm going to put the little jalapeno slices into these 4 jars. Then I'm going to take the dill and I'm going to chop it just a little bit, just to maybe bring out the flavors a little bit. I guess that's how dill works. But I'm going to chop it up and divide it among these 4 jars. I thought I might have had enough for 8 jars, but I didn't. But we're going to use it for these 4, and then I'll use dried dill that I have for the others. Now here I'm measuring how long I want my spears to be. This batch we're going to do in spears, and the other 4 we'll take the leftovers and make into rings. I ended up cutting each cucumber into 4 or 5, maybe 6 spears, just depending on how big the cucumber was. I wanted some regular size slices, and then you always need some smaller slices for stuffing into the voids. So we're going to get all these cut up, and then we'll start putting them in the jars. I'm going to stack them in there pretty tight. I don't want them floating up once I put the liquid in there. Now I found some of these might have been a little tall, only because we already had the jalapenos there in the bottom. But we make it all work. We can bend them and squish them a little bit. But you want to have them nice and tight so that they don't want to float. I like making refrigerator pickles like this. And you can do it dill, you can do bread and butter, you can do a sweet pickle, different variations of it. But it's really easy to do when you just have some leftovers like this, or maybe when you're going to have folks over in 2 or 3 days and you're serving something that you need to serve some pickles with. This is a great way to make a small batch of pickles, whether they be dill or bread and butter or sweet, whatever you need. Now I'm going to fill these with some of the cooled brine. Actually, I think I got more on the cabinet than I got in the jars, but you get the idea. Now once I get the brine in the jars, I'm going to wipe them down good, just like I would if I were going to put them in the canner. I'm not going to wipe with vinegar around the rings and the tops because we're not going to can them. But I am going to put a good lid on them. Screw them down tight. And I do wipe them off. I don't want them to be all sticky and such. But this way, they'll have a good top on them. We can open and close it easily. And they'll store in the refrigerator for a couple of weeks at least. Now we wait 2 to 3 days before we open them for eating. But after that, ooh, yum, yum. Gobble them up. Now for the rings, I'm going to add the same garlic powder in the bottom of each one. And in these, I add, I think it was a teaspoon of dried dill. Now we're going to take those ends that we cut off from the spears and we're just going to cut them into rings. And I cut them about an 1/8 inch thick. I want something that's going to hold up to the brine in the refrigerator and not be super flimsy. A lot of times I find when you slice with a mandolin, if you use the thin blade, they get to be really too thin and they just don't hold up and they don't stay crispy, that's for sure. Now we're going to pack these into the jars just like we did the spears. And we want to pack them in pretty nice and tight. I haven't found a good way to pack round cucumbers to where I get them all in there like they do commercially stuffed ones. It's like they're doing there, they all want to stack up in a pile, or they don't want to stack at all. And then I can't get that many in there. And then they always want to float. So if you have some good tips on stacking round pickles in a jar, let me know. Now I've done it with both wide mouth and the regular mouth jars, and it seems like it's the same with either one. So any good tips for packing round cucumbers into jars would be appreciated. Catch the runaway ones and make sure I get them all in there. And in the corner there. There we go. Now we're going to fill our jars with brine, just like we did with the spears. And just like we did with the spears, I'm going to make just as big a mess on the cabinet, because that's just how I roll. I try to contain it a little bit, but... And I do have one funnel that's not as bad as just this plain one, but on this day, I must have been in the mood for making a mess. And just like with the spears, I'm going to fill these to the top as much as I can. Now when I put the lid, it's going to squish them down and Cucumbers always squish a little bit when you put them in jars. I don't typically fill them this full when I'm canning them, but just because we're putting the lid on there and these going in the refrigerator, they're not going to be really sealed. I'm not so worried about leaving that headspace. Now, I love these reusable lids. I use them all the time, whether it's things for the refrigerator, whether it's in my dry storage, whether it's just to store nuts and bolts in a jar and put a lid on them so they don't all escape. They're very handy to have around. So there we go. Clean up my mess a little bit. We got 4 jars of slices, 4 jars of spears. The spears, of course, have the jalapeños there in the bottom. Pretty pretty. And in just a few days, they'll all be ready. Enjoy!